India. In his latest book entitled Has the West Lost It?, Professor Kishore Mahbubani argues that the West's two-century dominance as the global powerhouse is at the end. A new world order with China and India as the strongest economies is dawning. How will the West react to the status of superpower in decline? What does the future hold for the global multilateral system, and how should China navigate its own course to greater prominence? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore, Chung Chiu Senior Fellow at the China Institute of Fudan University. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Mahbubani. What does "it" in the title of the book actually mean here?
Oh, very simple. You know, the West has been the dominant civilization for the past 200 years, and they've always been the most successful civilization economically, politically, intellectually, culturally, and that's how they dominated the world for 200 years. And what's amazing is that the world's most successful civilization is losing it because it doesn't understand that the history has turned a corner. Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800, the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that the West could do so well. That's because China and India fell back. But now that China and India are coming back, the West has got to adjust and adapt to this new world. And the West hasn't woken up to that new
President
reality.
Trump put America first. Namely, he wants to challenge the idea of a multilateralism with preemptive strikes, such as the trade war that he has waged with his team, which is composed of hawks.
Yeah.
So do you think this is a zero-sum game? And do you think we live in post-West world?
I think it's a mistake to think that the problems are coming just because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is one factor.
No, he's a symbol of populism.
But a much more fundamental factor is the failure of the American intellectual establishment, the East Coast liberals, the famous people in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the CNN, who don't get it, that they have to tell their people that the time has now come for the West to adjust to a world where it can no longer dominate the world in the way that it used to do so in the past.
You know what happened to
and
me
that's
a few years ago?
That's a problem that's bigger than Donald Trump.
You know, Kishore, what happened to me a few years ago when I visited Brookings, which is considered the top think tank in the D.C. A young research fellow lost temper to me, you know, for what reasons? Because I said, it seems the United States lived in the past. You are still living in the 20th century, and we are now at the corner of a new millennium. And he was so angry with me, as if he really could not understand the new realities.
Yeah, you know, I'm really glad you had that experience, because what you have experienced is the rage of the American intellectuals who are so angry that they could, at one point in time, they could control the world, dominate, decide, do what they wanted to do, and they can feel the power evaporating from their hands. So the purpose of my book actually is to help the West to adjust to a new world, which is where it is in its own interest to stop being such a dominating force in the world. And my goal is to help the West, because I think both, one thing that China and the rest of the world share in common is that we want the West to adjust carefully, slowly, and not react angrily to this shift of power.
But I believe elites and the whole of the establishment in the United States are still convinced that they have the best soft power, the best education, I mean tertiary education, for example, the best resources, the best system, the best constitution, except for the worst presidency for the establishment. But what do you think of the idea in Chinese? There can't be two tigers in one mountain, and this is a zero-sum game. The United States believes that the future of China's economy is at the mercy of their strength. So the trade war.
You're right. America still has a tremendous amount of soft power. I spent 3 months in Columbia and Harvard universities this year. They have the world's best universities. They have the best think tanks. They have the best newspapers. But what they have completely lost is the art of long-term strategic thinking. And this is quite a shock for societies that have been successful for so long, as I said, for the past 200 years, to suddenly not realize that the world has changed, that they must adjust and adapt. And I actually don't think that there's just in this world one mountain and two tigers. I think our world, as you know, as the Prime Minister of India, former Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh said very wisely, the world is big enough for both China and India to continue to grow. And China and India were the two largest economies of the world for 1800 out of the last 2000 years. So as they keep growing, they're just occupying their natural space in the global order. And what the West has got to get used to is the fact that the 200 years of Western domination of world history in the 19th and 20th centuries was an aberration. Now all aberrations come to a natural end. So the first idea that the West must accept, especially the East Coast liberal intellectuals, is that this 200-year period of Western domination has been an aberration. It cannot continue. It is ending.
But Kishore, there is a small aberration in your analysis, I'm afraid.
Sure.
There are growing divisions across the Atlantic in the relationship between the United States and the European Union, between the United States and other member states of the NATO, with regard to the defense costs. Bigger share by European allies of the costs. Not only that, it's also about the punitive tariffs on steel and aluminum. So Chancellor Angela Merkel starts to say it's time for us to take the destination of the European Union into our own hands, and we'll give more thoughts to a closer relationship with the PRC and perhaps with India. So what do you think of not having a monolithic voice coming out of the West, quote unquote?
The reason why they're having these difficulties, the reason why populist president is being elected in America, the reason why populist parties are rising in Europe is precisely because the West has failed to make a structural adjustment to the return of China and India. And when you fail to make structural adjustment, in my book, Has the West Lost It?, I point out that after China joined the WTO in 2001, it was inevitable that because of China's new competitive dynamic, jobs would be lost in the West. And so the populism that you see in the West today that creates these difficulties between Europe and America is the result of the structural changes that I point out in my book, Has the West Lost It? So if they want to find a long-term answer to the challenge of populism, to these divisions that are rising in the West, they must look at the big picture and see how the West adjusts to this big picture. Is the failure to adjust to this big picture that has caused these problems among them today?
Both Europeans and Americans accuse China of practicing state capitalism, meaning the government-led industrial policies beat their expectations about drastic domestic internal political transformation since our day one of the entry into the WTO. They want China to be one of them in terms of universal values, sharing the same political institutions, so on and so forth. But China is not. And therefore, do you think they have been left disillusioned, and do you think China exceptionalism will start to pick up? I mean, what do you think of the differences?
Well, I think, I'm glad you mentioned this idea of state capitalism, because many in America, as you know, believe that China is competing unfairly and China has a trade surplus with the United States because of what they call state capitalism. Actually, the reason why United States has trade deficits is because it has the exorbitant privilege, as someone said, of being able to print money to import goods. So when Chinese export products to America, Chinese workers have to work very, very hard and get paid very little to export products to America. How does America pay for these products? It prints money. So clearly, it's that exorbitant privilege that's the cause of this problem.
What do you think of the future of using euro to replace or to phase out the American dollars so that we will not pin our future on the American dollar hegemony?
Well, let me first deal with your first point that you raised, which is a very important point about some voices in America wanting to thwart China's rise. In fact, I was going to tell you my project this year, I'm on a sabbatical this year for 9 months, and my goal this year is to write a book on US-China relations, because clearly the most important relationship is between the world's #1 power, which is United States America, and the world's #1 emerging power, which is China. And history teaches us, and Graham Allison has shown this, that when the #2 power is about to overtake the #1 power, you get rising levels of tension between the two. So clearly we have to worry about US-China relations. But I would say don't just listen to the voices like Navarro, Lighthizer, Steve Bannon. There are other voices in America also. And it's important for us to also deal with the other voices in America, because the other voices in America are advocating a more constructive approach towards China also. And you mustn't assume that, as you know, the United States is not a monolithic country, has never been a monolithic country. But the other point about Europe, I think I agree with you. This is a tremendous opportunity now for Europe to show some leadership, because the Europeans deeply disagree with President Trump's trade policies. In fact, they are much even more angry than China is in some ways, because they say, we are your friends and you're treating us like an enemy, right? That's how the Europeans feel, and that's why Chancellor Angela Merkel has said the time has come. But we must allow the Europeans, I would say, give them time to apply the pressure for that to be the reaction, and then you'll find that America will moderate its policies.
Thank you so much. Should we relate the unilateralism of the Trump presidency to isolationism that perhaps started from the farewell speech of George Washington, founding father of the United States? We'll come back to examine and figure out what President Trump really wants. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Kishore Mahbubani, a Chunqiu Research Fellow with Fudan University, but he's actually a professor with the National University of Singapore. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Kishore.
Pleasure.
You are the author of many, many books. With the end of the Cold War, do you think you have remained consistent with your focus about the decline of the West and the rise of the Eastern Hemisphere, or in other words, the rise of Asian Hemisphere?
Well, absolutely. And indeed, one of the key points I make in my latest book, Has the West Lost It?, is that one of the biggest strategic mistakes the West made was at the end of the Cold War, because there was this incredibly triumphalist spirit in the West, and they celebrated Francis Fukuyama's famous essay at the end of history that said, hey, the West, we have made it, the rest have got to copy us, we don't have to do anything. And as I say in my book, in a very cruel fashion, Francis Fukuyama's essay did a lot of brain damage to the West, because what he did was that he put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when China and India were waking up. And the reason why the West feels so lost today is because they were asleep when China and India woke up. And so this is why the goal of my book always is to help the West to understand the strategic mistakes it has made. So one was, of course, falling asleep at the end of the Cold War, and the other was things like the foolish decision to expand NATO and alienate Russia, and the equally unwise decision to invade
Russia
Iraq.
was seriously humiliated in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War with the eastward expansion of the NATO. Now, many liberals in China, we have a huge army of liberals who are so pro-US values, point out that they are very sad about President Trump, who is ready to give up the American global leadership. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well,
abandoning the global leadership?
I think America's global leadership rests on many pillars. It doesn't just rely on the president. And I think we should appreciate the many strengths that American society has. And I must tell you, after spending 3 months in Columbia and Harvard universities, I'm just astonished at how amazing American universities are and how powerfully they try to re-examine what's going on in the world. So, for example, my ideas are resisted by the American media, but welcomed by the American professors who want to say, hey, this is a different point of view, I must listen to it, and I must see what I do about it. So I would say we should continue to work with America and not assume that President Trump's relatively unilateral policies represent the mainstream of America. In fact, I expect the pendulum to swing back after President Trump towards a more mainstream president, because that represents the consensus of the American body politic.
James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, said in his keynote speech at the graduation ceremony of the Naval College that Russia and China, DPRK and terrorism will be the major threats to the national security of the United States. So when the pendulum swings back, I mean, we are afraid that there will still be the consensus, bipartisan consensus, that China will be a geopolitical rivalry of the United States. Will we come back to the beginning of the
there will be geopolitical rivalry between United States and China. That's a given. You can't stop that. But when you use a word like a threat, it implies that there might be something like a war emerging between US and China, and no serious person believes that a war is likely between US and China, despite what Graham Allison said in his book. But I do want to emphasize...
Why do you think there wouldn't be a war? Only because we are both nuclear armed?
No, I think, yes, definitely. If you have a war between two nuclear armed powers, you have two losers and no winners. That's a fact of life, and that's why there's been no war between any two nuclear powers. But you're absolutely right that geopolitical rivalry between United States and China will grow. That's an inevitable fact that
will
will
it
come.
spin out of control?
The question is how you manage it. And that's why it's very important. And I'm
very good question. You ask a very good question, Professor Mahbubani. You know why the Korean War had started? It's mistakes by both sides. Now,
correct.
China didn't believe the Americans would land in Incheon, and the U.S. The policymakers didn't listen or heed the advice or warning by late Premier Zhou Enlai. Late Premier Zhou Enlai said, "We never trade our core stakes and the principles for whatever you want, and we'll never ever accept Americans crossing the 30th parallel." But both sides turned a blind eye or deaf ear to each other.
Which is why it is so wonderful that you had this meeting between President Donald Trump and President Kim Jong-un in Singapore a few weeks ago, because that meeting was so critical and so important. Because, as you know, the Korean border is the most militarized border on planet Earth, the most dangerous border on planet Earth. And I'm so glad that President Donald Trump ignored the advice of everybody and had a meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore.
So you think?
So I think President Donald Trump...
Nobel Prize will be given to him?
Absolutely. I think that President Donald Trump and President Kim Jong-un should be given the Nobel Peace Prize, because they broke a problem that had been frozen for, almost 70 years. Now, that's not easy. No American president before President Donald Trump had the courage to have a direct meeting with a North Korean leader. And I think that's why, in some ways, we can acknowledge that President Donald Trump has made mistakes, like in trade wars and so on and so forth. But when he does the right thing, we should praise him. And as you know, unfortunately, the American liberals will not praise him.
Are you saying Nobel Peace Prize should be given to someone who's considered by most Chinese mad, lunatic, when he used words like fire and fury, rocket man, maximum pressure to be imposed on the DPRK? I mean, the unpredictability of this man, most elites and people of the establishment in the United States don't believe him. And do you think this guy should be given Nobel Peace Prize? Give me a break.
Well, this is where it's a mistake for you to accept the political correctness of the American, what I call liberal elites. They don't understand that you needed a man like President Donald Trump, who was in some ways wild enough to organize his meeting. And I must say, I'm shocked by all this negative commentary that is coming out on that meeting, because frankly, one major problem in the world whose temperature was this high has now come down, and that's a significant improvement. You know, what we need to do is to build on it and do it.
Kim Jong-un came to China twice within 1 month, and we provided him with a Boeing plane and took him to Singapore. We played a pivotal role in broking the peace, like what we did during the process of six-party talks. So maybe our leaders should also be given Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, in fact, I think that the two other leaders who played a critical roles were the leaders of China, President Xi Jinping, and the President of South Korea, President Moon. So I think these are the four leaders who played a very critical role, and I think who deserve to be applauded and rewarded.
Chinese government has always called for the two sides, DPRK and Washington, to suspend A, the war game, and B, the nuclear or missile tests. And what happens now is exactly what we want, what the Chinese authorities want. So what do you think of the attitude and policy options of ASEAN about South China Sea? I mean, China is viewed as assertive, territorial claims that go against other competitors. So what do you think of the latest development?
Well, I'm actually very happy that the temperature on the South China Sea issue has gone down. I don't read about it in the papers every day. And I think it's very important that ASEAN and China have a good relationship, because I can tell you one thing. As China grows and becomes more and more powerful, there'll be a lot of concern about the rise of China. It's important for there to be one place where all the great powers can meet and talk to each other comfortably. And that's the biggest contribution that ASEAN is making to geopolitical stability in East
the aberration
Asia.
is that the Pentagon has sent warships into the territorial waters of China, and this runs the risk of having direct head-on confrontation between the two biggest militaries.
I agree with you that we should avoid military maneuvers, but I think it's equally important for there to continue to be venues where you can have trust building, grow and develop, and that's what ASEAN has been doing with its annual meeting. That's why in my last book, The ASEAN Miracle, I proposed that last year, ASEAN on its 50th anniversary should have been given the Nobel Peace Prize too.
Exactly. ASEAN is no doubt one of the most successful regional blocs in terms of maintaining peace and prosperity through the collective consensus building efforts. Now, the last question, I need to have a quick answer before we conclude this meaningful discussion about why the West has lost it. The fact that China rises fast, and that's one of the major topics we have under our discussion. Very quickly, what do you think of the legacy of Deng Xiaoping, and what do you think of the most important things in your memory and in your vocabulary about the success of China's economy when we commemorate the 40th anniversary of China's opening up and reform this year? Don't forget, Deng Xiaoping paid a visit to Singapore in the wake of the Cultural Revolution, and he drew a lot of inspirations from the late leader Lee Kuan Yew.
I think the one phrase of Mr. Deng Xiaoping we should all remember is his famous quotation: "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat." So it doesn't matter whether President Donald Trump is black or whether he's white. If he brings peace in the Korean Peninsula, he's doing a good thing. Let's be pragmatic, and let's celebrate the pragmatism of Mr. Deng Xiaoping on the 40th anniversary of China's reforms.
Thank you so much for giving us this advice. With that, we come to the end of this edition with Professor Kishore Mahbubani from the National University of Singapore. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.